All right, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank you and welcome you to attending our ICP webinar today entitled Transitioning to Ready-to-Administer IV Medications. Can it be both safe and affordable? So let me just go over some housekeeping slides while people are still logging in here. So this slide is just a disclosure slide from ProCE, just stating that all the faculty today, me, John, and Chris, have no financial disclosures. I'm sorry, Chris and I don't have financial disclosures. John is an advisor consultant for Cineas Kabi as well. In addition, this is just a disclaimer and disclosure slides from ProCE. All of you can read these later as well. I will make note that within the chat box, you can find a link to the handouts. That link will take you to the page on ICP's website, and the handouts can be found at the bottom of that page. This is a CE program for pharmacy and pharmacy technicians, provided by ProCE and ICP as well, credit for 1 contact hour today. Also, you'll see the slide here. We'll bring this back up at the end of the presentation, but you'll see instructions on this slide of how to log into ProCE, a specific link for this program, and at the very end, you will see get an attendance code after Chris is done presenting today. This program has also been approved for up to 1 hour of California State Nursing contact hours from Deborah Simmons, as well for any nurses attending today. And before I start the objectives, and we just say that the bios for both John and Chris are also found on the page, the link that you see in the chat box. I'll put the materials in here again and send them forward to you. So please, you see John and Chris's extensive work that leads into this presentation. Also, we'll have about 10 minutes of time at the end to take questions and answers. So in the bottom of the Zoom panel, you'll see the Q&A button. So please put your questions in the Q&A button and not in the chat box as well. So to get this program started, let's quickly review the objectives for today's presentation. First, I will review some of the risks associated with preparing and administering IV meds that are also manipulated at the bedside. Second, John will follow up and talk about comparing studies evaluating the cost and safety comparisons between manufacturer-prepared, pre-filled, ready-to-administer or RTA products versus traditional vial syringe products. And then Chris will come along at the end and talk about his organization's perspective of the financial savings and improved safety from transitioning from traditional vial syringe medications to manufacturer-prepared, pre-filled RTA products. So as a quick background here before I pass it on to John, just make people appreciate the volume and amount of use of IV medications overall in healthcare. And it's a very common component, obviously in acute care settings, but also in other settings from home infusion, home care, long-term care facilities, and infusion centers as well. So IV medication use is pervasive. And there's a lot of things that can go wrong based on the steps that are required when making these products in many ways. So we're going to say they're properly compounded. That could be diluting things, combining things, putting one thing into a bag, diluting them, pulling them together into a vial. So there's a lot of processes associated with making an injectable product to make it ready to be given to the patient at the bedside. And ICP did a survey a couple of years ago about compounding outside the pharmacy. And we asked people what are the most commonly prepared types of sterile injections made outside of pharmacy. And you see the 3 on this bullet on this slide here. Number 1, IV push meds. When people are taking a vial, transferring it to a syringe, hopefully not diluting it, and then giving an IV push. Followed by intermittent infusions and IM injections. In this next slide, we'll also just give you an idea of the amount of preparation that's being done outside a nice, sterile, not distracted area like the compound area with a pharmacy. So you see the number of people that answered always or often in all these situations, IV push meds, almost 60% said that they always or often prepare IV push meds outside pharmacy on the floor. Intermittent infusions, over half of people said they always or often prepare these infusions out of the pharmacy on the floor area or in the care areas, followed by IM injections, which are almost 40% of the time. And I think, especially for pharmacists on the line, you have to just appreciate the risks that are associated with it. And I know sometimes pharmacists are thinking, well, Matt, it's a vial, or they're putting it into a syringe. What's the big deal? What could possibly go wrong? And, there are actually quite a few things that can go wrong for something even as simple as preparing an IV push med, let alone an infusion or IM shot. In the survey, 31% of the respondents were aware of or personally experienced errors when preparing or mixing injectable meds. And the key thing we need to understand is the people who are compounding these outside pharmacy, they have no checks and balances. They probably don't have a sterile, clean area to make it. It's probably not distraction-free, especially for nurses who are caring for multiple patients. This is done in a rush, a non-clean area, and no one's checking what they did for sterility, for whatever it may be, or correctness. For example, you see the top errors reported below. 82% of respondents reported either wrong drug errors, wrong dosing errors, wrong concentrations, or wrong diluents, or the wrong volume of the diluent. And look how many have no labeling or a labeling error, which is another offshoot of when you have preparation outside pharmacy. But also don't forget about the sterility risk as well. It's, there have been studies on this slide here and other studies showing the possibility of contamination when meds are prepared in a clinical environment versus the pharmacy environment. And this is one of those tough things, everyone. Like, you're not going to probably readily tie in someone's infection because of a compounding practice on the floor. That's what makes this difficult. That's what we have to rely on studies to actually review and ascertain the potential sterility issues, and also contributing factors you see at the bottom of the slide, from, again, the environment they're working in and the distractions, the qualifications of staff and their experiences, their training, how often they do it. If they do it once in a blue moon or very frequently, make this big difference as well. And their knowledge about what aseptic technique actually means. So to bring this whole thing into focus, we have to really consider and look at ways to eliminate the need for any type of compounding and potential risk for hospital-acquired infections by potentially capitalizing on commercially prepared products. ICB has always been stating, if possible, try to buy something that's already made, makes things a lot easier. And John and Chris will go over more of that in detail in the next couple of slides. But also, we got to really, first, I would say, especially for pharmacists on the line here today, are you aware of compounding outside your pharmacy? What is being, and what has to be compounded, or what's being compounded that you're not even aware of, and try to remove that need as much as possible to get it inside the pharmacy and or dispense ready-to-administer products as well. But also look about reducing the steps required for wasting controlled substances like the opioids. That's a whole nother process issue we have to deal with as well. ICP will be having webinars in February, March next year around diversion. So we'll touch on that topic more later on. But on that note, I'm going to now pass this program over to John to take it away.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are in the world today. Appreciate your kind attention, and thank you to Matt for the introduction and for the invitation. Really my pleasure to kick off the next portion of the presentation, where we're going to look at some research and add some evidence to this discussion to create a more holistic view of ready-to-administer versus traditional vial and syringe products. Next slide, please. As Matt kindly outlined, there are significant risks associated with the preparation and compounding of sterile preparations. Harm has occurred, significant harm will continue to occur if we don't do a much better job getting a handle on safe sterile compounding. Next slide, please. Because of this, for many years, experts have come together to develop best practices and consensus statements to help guide us, provide safe and effective sterile compounding. The first of these was in 1999, where experts came together to evaluate the relative safety of non-electronic drug delivery systems that were available at that time. Now, this group of experts used a decision analysis that ranked 6 different systems on a variety of metrics, including safety, cost, simplicity of use, as well as the training required to effectively implement that system. At that time, in 1999, manufacturer-prepared products were considered the safest and the best, followed by point-of-care activated and then pharmacy-based admixture systems. Importantly, the requirement for a combination of systems, given a varied patient population or needs, was discussed, but a lack of availability of the highly rated systems was noted. There weren't a lot of manufacturer-prepared products at that time. Next slide, please. A follow-on consensus conference was completed in 2008. Again, a group of experts came together and ranked 5 systems, but noted very few major developments. Multiple variables, including applicability, ease of use, regulatory compliance, were all used to assess systems. And again, manufacturer prepared were the highest ranked. But this panel of experts did note the complexity of IV medication delivery had increased, our patient population, and the complexity of delivering safe IV care was getting more difficult, and no single system met all needs or situations. Next slide. Since 2008, a lot has happened. I think that's probably a huge understatement. There have been many regulatory or standards changes, including multiple revisions, including the most recent to USP Chapters 797 and 800. There have been various updates to the National Patient Safety Goals, passage of the 2013 Drug Quality and Security Act, which are still being implemented. Initiatives have been launched like Standardized for Safety, and there's been a rapid development and expansion of technology. There also have been a significant number of clinical challenges, not to mention drug shortages, which are ongoing, pricing and access issues, as well as those problems associated with the pandemic, not to mention staffing and workforce. Next slide, please. Given these changes since 2008, another consensus development best practice conference was convened in 2018. I had the honor of chairing this conference, and if we look at the next slide, what we did is brought together experts in the field of sterile compounding and trying to develop consensus statements on what is going to guide the safe delivery of IV compounded products in the future. As part of that process, which was a very iterative, process-driven, committee-related process, we asked a number of different questions. I don't want to go through all of these. We would take up all of our time if I did, but I want to call your attention to one of these questions. And if you go to the next slide, I want to highlight this one. And what we did is we asked all the experts at this consensus development conference, do you agree with this statement? And the statement was the majority of US hospitals have a complete understanding of the various factors that contribute to cost effectiveness of delivering safe IV admixtures to patients, including factors like the product as well as staffing waste. And at this time, not a single person could agree with this. It was a 0% agreed that they had a good understanding of the holistic costs that go into providing safe and effective IV products. So we knew there was a gap. We knew there was a clear gap here when we're asking the experts, and no one has a complete understanding of this. Next slide, please. In addition to those bits of information, we also did develop 10 consensus development statements, which are available in the publication, which is listed on this slide. Again, I'm not going to read through all of these, but want to call your attention to 2 statements. One, manufacturer-prepared products are the safest IV drug delivery system, and manufacturer-prepared ready-to-administer products are preferred whenever possible. That was a consensus statement developed by this group of experts. Again, reaffirming that manufacturer-prepared products are preferred. Next slide, please. The other statement I want to call your attention to is number 10. And it states the organizational costs of inaction or pursuing the minimum action necessary with regards to the safety of IV drug delivery far exceed the institutional financial investment in the safest systems for patient and staff. Now, that's a lot of words. And what it means is it costs organizations a lot less to invest upfront, be proactive in their investment rather than wait long term and pay the price later down the road. But to do that, we must have a better understanding of what those costs of inaction are and the holistic costs that go into a complete financial picture of providing safe compounded products. Next slide, please. And essentially what we're talking about then is cost effectiveness. It's not just looking at the one ledger item or the line item in a particular budget for one drug cost. It's what are all the factors and contributing inputs that go into providing safe care. On this slide, I've listed a few of them. They're the safety considerations. We, of course, have direct cost considerations, the cost of the product, the cost of waste, not only waste of the drug that we throw away, but also waste to our workforce that's involved in the process. We have compliance costs, both making sure that we're compliant with our regulatory requirements, but also with laws. And then there's a litigation component here. Drug diversion, we will touch on drug diversion. Again, that can be an entirely different conversation, but there are costs associated with drug diversion, as well as a number of external costs, including those associated with drug shortages. Let's first start with safety. So on the next slide, I want to call your attention to a peer-reviewed publication that I was PI on along with my research team. This was published back in 2018. And if we go through to the next slide, I'll outline what we found in this particular study. This was a prospective, multi-site observational study conducted in 3 separate health systems across the United States. In this study, researchers observed and compared a ready-to-administer product versus the status quo, which is that IV push traditional practice vial and syringe. And what we were trying to identify is what were the comparative error rates between the 2 methods. What we did is we outlined all the different process steps to safely administer ready-to-administer products and all the different process steps to safely administer vial and syringe. And then we actually observed those administrations in real time, which would be considered best practice, and then documented how many errors occurred in each one of those arms. In total, 329 observations were collected, and we observed 260 errors across all of those observations. When looking specifically at the data of this study, we observed an error rate for ready-to-administer products of 2.5% compared to an observed error rate for traditional vial and syringe practice at 10.4%. Therefore, this ready-to-administer group did demonstrate a statistically significant lower observed error rate, which were associated with fewer observed preparation and administration errors. If we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit more about waste. We talked about waste being a major factor. We know in our health systems, we unfortunately waste a lot. And it's not just about wasting the product or the medication, but it's also maybe not using our workforce, our very valuable workforce, in the most effective and efficient way. And so I want to call your attention to another peer-reviewed publication completed by my research team. If we go to the next slide, we'll walk through some of the details here. And what we found is that there's a significant medication waste problem that really impacts all of us across the healthcare spectrum. Waste decreases staff productivity, increases overall labor expense, and ultimately adversely impacts patient care. Let's go to the next slide. This is amplified in certain areas of our hospital, and one of those areas where we see significant waste and potential harm is in our OR and procedural areas, and there's a variety of reasons for this. Medication errors that occur in the OR can be especially problematic. Oftentimes, our anesthesia provider may be the only person involved in the entire process. They're prescribing, formulating, dispensing, administering, as well as potentially even wasting, removing some double checks that are inherent in some of our other systems. One study completed, not ours, did a comprehensive expert review, and it evaluated 138 different recommendations to improve the safety and efficacy of care in the OR. And the highest ranked out of those 138 were 1, standardized concentrations, have written policies for safety and follow them, and then use pre-filled whenever possible, kind of echoing some of our other best practice statements. A separate study collected data on over 13,000 prepared drug syringes and essentially found a lot of waste. The mean waste here was 38%, with an estimated yearly waste of 139,531 syringes. Which is significant. One of the quotes from this article is the overall extent of drug wastage in the ORs and ICUs is concerning. And I think we all kind of share that concern, especially when it comes to some of our high-risk medicines, including opioids. So if we go to the next slide and talk a little bit about drug diversion and the risk associated with opioids, this is my favorite, if you can have a favorite, drug diversion quote. And the quote is, "If you haven't caught anyone, you may not be looking hard enough." And one of the strategies we can use to limit the impact of drug diversion or the likelihood for it to occur is, if you go to the next slide, is to limit waste in our health systems. Because if you have medication floating around that hasn't been administered, is not documented, that can be considered waste, that represents an opportunity to divert that medicine. So the less floating around our hospitals, the less risk we have. And if we go to the next slide, there are clearly some best practices to help us avert or mitigate those risks. We're very familiar that laws and best practices dictate that for our controlled substances, we need to appropriately dispose of them. It must occur immediately with documentation by 2 health professionals. This compliance requires investment of time and resources. That's time our staff, our workforce is being pulled away from other activities, including patient care. Now, there clearly needed to be some more evidence-based assessment of what is the scope of this waste. And there had been some modeling published and some previous research that had found significant costs associated with both disposal as well as workforce. But research was needed to better understand the financial and workforce costs. And there had been no really observation-based method to do this. It had all been mathematical modeling, which leads me to the next study that I want to talk about, which is that peer-reviewed publication, to walk through some of those results. And this is essentially what our research team did, is we went into some inpatient units and we observed waste occurring in real time, both of the medication as well as the workforce. We looked at 669 distinct waste observations that met inclusion criteria. We looked at morphine, hydromorphone, and fentanyl. And we collected information during 15 days across 4 different distinct units, which represented 80 beds split between 2 hospitals. Over that 15 days, we found 207 milligrams of hydromorphone was wasted and just shy of 18,000 micrograms of fentanyl wasted. Now, to accomplish that and to comply, nursing staff time was needed, and a lot of it. So of that nursing time, we found that about just shy of 850 minutes was dedicated to wasting just those 3 medicines, which represented 14.16 hours across those 15 days. We then applied Bureau of Labor Statistics data to help determine and convert that into costs, which we'll see in the next slide. Before we do that, though, I do want to call your attention to table 2, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, but if we just call out fentanyl, for example, we have a 100 microgram vial. It's a 50 per ml, 2 ml vial. About 50% of the time, half of that vial was wasted. It was just thrown away, just as one example. And if we go to the next slide, we'll look at what some of the financial impacts of that were. Spread across all 3 medicines, what we found is the average total cost per dose wasted was $2.40, meaning anytime you opened a vial, you were throwing away $2.40. When a yearly extrapolation model is applied, the total waste for our study was over $35,000. Remember, that's 3 drugs and only 80 beds. 86 of the 669 pharmaceutical waste or product wastes observed were interrupted in some way. There's a patient safety, medication safety concern and discussion about that, because if we're interrupting a process, it may not be done correctly. The average time to chart the waste was 2 hours, 4 minutes, and 52 seconds. And 31 of the 669 wastes were documented more than 8 hours after removal. To me, that would be a potential red flag. We would look into that for potential diversion or other non-compliance. And you can see some cost data here where that workforce waste does contribute significantly to the total waste, in addition to just throwing away product. Next slide, please. So now we've reviewed some of those variables, some of those inputs that maybe give us a more holistic or clear picture of what is the total cost of providing intravenous compounded therapy safely. There's a safety argument here. There's a direct cost argument here, not only the product, but also workforce. We didn't even get into compliance and some of the litigation costs, cost to society associated with drug diversion, and some of the external costs. We need to make sure that we incorporate many of these inputs into an overarching assessment of cost effectiveness for RTA versus traditional vial and syringe. And if we go to the next slide, if we take multiple inputs rather than just a single line item, we're going to get a more clear picture of that puzzle. And that leads me to a discussion about cost effectiveness on the next slide. My research team and I found this to be a need, and there needed to be some evidence. We wanted to be able to do research in cost effectiveness and hopefully add additional literature to this discussion. And if we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about what is cost effectiveness. This might be familiar to all of you on the webinar today. So allow me just a moment to review what cost effectiveness is. And a cost effectiveness analysis is a way to evaluate costs and health outcomes of one or more interventions. There has to be an intervention. And what it does is it compares an intervention to either another intervention or to the status quo. So you can compare two interventions against each other or a single intervention to what the status quo is. And what a cost effectiveness analysis will give you is a incremental cost to obtain a certain health outcome. For example, death prevented or error avoided. Because a CEA is comparative, the intervention can only be considered effective compared to something else. So there has to be a comparator, and it does allow for multiple inputs to be considered. A CEA can be a very useful tool when comparing the health and cost impacts of a multitude of interventions. Next slide, please. Therefore, the aim of my work in our study was to develop a robust cost effectiveness model for manufacturer-prepared, ready-to-administer products versus traditional vial and syringe, looking specifically at those three opioids I've already mentioned: fentanyl, hydromorphone, and morphine. Next slide, please. This particular analysis was conducted focusing on inpatient units with a total of 15,727 observations, which is essentially a period of a year. So it's taking the observations I've mentioned in previous literature, extrapolating that out to a year, looking at that 15,727 observations. Because a cost effectiveness analysis really should have multiple inputs, a variety of parameters were used for our CEA, both cost and probability parameters. If we look at the cost metrics or cost inputs, we have the AWP, cost of the drug. We used AWP because that's what previous literature had used. So in order to maintain consistency and validity, we used AWP. We used the cost associated with preparing the particular medicine. We used the cost associated with administering the medicine, the cost of waste of that medicine, as well as the cost associated with errors, looking specifically at preparation and administration errors. Now, we also know that not every preparation or administration leads to a problem or to an error. And so there's a series of probabilities that must also be included in a CEA. There's the probability of a medication preparation and administration error per observation. There's then the probability of that error actually leading to harm, because we know not all errors lead to harm. And then not all errors or harm are created equal. And so then there's the probability of that harm categorized by severity, from significant to serious to life-threatening. So we have this series of cost inputs, and then we have this series of probabilities. Out of those, we created a decision tree. And so you have a tree that's built in a modeling software, and a series of different models are run based on that decision tree and the probability of each different scenario occurring. If we go to the next slide. We put all of this into a software program and ran this model 10,000 times, 10,000 different scenarios, to determine what was the relative cost effectiveness of ready-to-administer versus vial and syringe. This slide here is a Monte Carlo probability distribution diagram that was an output of that modeling. What it does is depicts incremental cost effectiveness ratio, or ICERs, and there was a little bit of a range from 19,000 to 28,000. What that means is there was a range, but you see there's a definite coming together of probabilities between 21,500 and 21,000. Essentially what this means is about 21,000 to 22,000 incremental cost effectiveness dollars were gained for every error avoided. Therefore, if you avoided an error, you're saving about $22,000 by using RTA. And if we go to the next slide, we'll go through a few more of these results. Out of our robust statistical model, we found the RTA arm was associated with a 94% reduction in errors when compared to vial and syringe. In our model, we prevented about 127 different errors with RTA versus vial and syringe. This resulted in that ICER, or that incremental savings average, of about $22,554 per error avoided. But importantly, RTA spread across. Whether you prevented all those errors or not, RTA was the least costly option compared with traditional vial and syringe by $182 per administration. Meaning, based on our financial model, when we take safety into account, the waste into account, the different direct costs into account in this model, you save about $182 per administration by using RTA. Due to that decrease primarily in medication errors, if you extrapolated that out, the RTA can estimate to save $2.9 million per year. And again, that's based on that 15,727 observations. If we go to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about practice changes because, we have a body of evidence now, which tells a story, which gives us some inputs into this evidence-based model. But ultimately, the most important point here is products must be both safe and effective. We have to have evidence. We have to have research. Our model does provide a robust opportunity to evaluate costs holistically. It was repeated 10,000 different times to come up with this data. But don't take our word for it. I really do encourage you all on this call to conduct your own pilot studies. Now, you don't necessarily need to repeat everything we did in our work, but take bits and pieces. Observe your own practice. Pull your own data. Use your own data to assess where you are at, because then you can tell that story. And my guess is you'll notice that there is opportunity for you if you look at the big picture holistically. That compelling narrative should include all elements that include both direct costs as well as these other costs, ultimately to help us provide better patient care. So if we go to the next slide, I want to leave you with a few key takeaways. Providing safe IV therapy is definitely complex, and it's never been more complex than it is today. But time after time, manufacturer-prepared, ready-to-administer products have been affirmed by best practices and experts as the preferred whenever possible. Importantly, various factors or inputs contribute to the safe and effective use of sterile products. We can't just look at the AWP and say, that's it, I'm going to go with the cheapest option. We must understand the total cost and relative effectiveness of delivering safe IV therapy. By integrating and adopting ready-to-administer, it could play an important role in helping you improve care, building efficiency into your system, increasing patient safety, and ultimately making sure that our bottom line supports providing the safest possible care to our patients. Now, to talk a little bit about how this impacts his practice and how he's been able to translate this into practice, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Chris Fortier. Thanks, Chris.
Great. Thanks, John, and hello, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. I'm hopefully going to complement a lot of what John spoke about today, and hopefully you can kind of see really a lot of the justifications in using ready-to-administer products at your institution. I'm going to start with a quick little exercise, but I'm going to really talk about some of the data, a study that I was involved with around sort of system vulnerabilities and human factors engineering, and then really talk more about the practical aspects of things to consider as you look to potentially implement these types of products into your institutions or make the decisions around, do I prepare this on my own, or do I buy more of a commercially or ready to use product? So next slide, please. So a quick, and maybe quickly using, we can't raise hands, I usually do this obviously in a live room, but maybe using the question and answer function. I'm going to show in a second another slide, and as quickly as you can determine how many of the results are out of range, maybe you just tap into the chat what that number is, and we can see how fast you can figure that out. So Matt, if you could go to the next slide, we'll just do this quick exercise. Oh, got a couple raised hands. Okay. All right, so fairly quick. Thank you for that. All right, next slide. So let's try this a little bit again, maybe a different way. So again, I want you to raise your hand when you know how many results are out of range. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so much faster. You can see the numbers of those who can see the hands raised. It's going kind of wild there. All right, perfect. Well, thank you for that. So really my purpose of this exercise is to really kind of talk about human factors, how they impact safety, where there is potential risk and vulnerability, and how do we sort of reduce that risk and ultimately make things easier for the provider, for the technician, for the pharmacist, you name it. How do we consider those human factors aspects in, again, reducing safety and improving ultimately quality? Next slide, please. So just a quick little background. I am the Chief Pharmacy Officer at Mass General Hospital in Boston. You can see here a 1,000-bed academic medical center, have a variety of multidisciplinary care offerings. Basically, any type of patient population we are serving in our institution. We also have about 100 pediatric beds and have a very large research portfolio and a very large research clinical trials pharmacy team at our institution. And I guess I should probably first state, in terms of product that we use, right? So we always are having kind of the decision around, is this a product that we can buy commercially, right? You saw back in John's slides, you know, that is ultimately kind of the gold standard, right? If we don't have to prepare it and we can get it commercially available and it fits the needs in terms of doses and volumes and strengths, you know, that's where we ultimately want to use. We do use a variety of ready-to-use products, primarily in our OR and OR kits. But we do use some of those products, mainly some narcotics, outside of the OR and some other areas as well. And again, I'll talk through a little bit of what the types of products that we use, where we use them as I go through this. Next slide, please. So, and Matt, I'll ask you just to maybe click through 4 times here because I have a couple animations. So, you know, when we think about med errors, Matt talked about it a little bit at the beginning and the risk of even just simply taking a vial and putting it into a syringe. Some of this data is a little bit more anesthesia and OR specific. So 1 in every 25 med administrations in the peri-op potentially has a med error. We know in pharmacy, not just in the OR, there's a lot of distractions, production pressure, what's the oversight. Some studies have shown in anesthesia, we've seen the types of errors being incorrect dose, substitution errors, and omission. And when you look at some of the medication error data, same thing kind of overall, incorrect dose being kind of the largest. About, I think that the number I saw from a study from years ago is around 70%, mainly being the incorrect dose as the main type of error we've seen in pharmacy. And then sort of an anesthesiologist survey here, you can see that 89% admitted to a drug area at one point in their time. So obviously, I think we all know, whether it be in the OR setting, whether it be in other settings throughout the hospital, there's definitely the opportunity there for error. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about a study that I conducted actually in my previous institution, an academic medical center in Charleston, South Carolina, looking specifically at I'll title it self-fill syringes versus pre-filled or ready-to-use syringes. And we partnered with a human factors engineer and her PhD student to basically really do 2 things. Our primary endpoint was first sort of looking at following the path of a general surgery case, all the different steps of that self-filled medication, from the time it left the OR pharmacy to comes into the OR room, all the different preps and processes that the anesthesiologist or CRNA make for that product, and then sort of the steps back into the pharmacy. And we follow that, again, one for self-filled, as well as the same process for pre-filled and ready to fill. So that was the primary workflow analysis that we conducted. There were 2 other secondary endpoints that we looked at. One was just a focus group with the different providers to say, what is your satisfaction? Did you like this? Did you not like this? What were the pros? What were the cons? And then the third piece, a little bit separate of the overall study, was looking at waste. And I know John talked about that a little bit. Ours is a little bit simpler in terms of how we looked at it, but I will talk through that in a little bit detail in a moment. Next slide, please. So the results of that study, in my opinion, are pretty telling. And this was a article that we got published in Anesthesiology, which is a huge anesthesia journal, back probably about 10 years ago now. And again, you can see the number of cases that we followed, the process steps. Process steps weren't really necessarily significantly less. However, the vulnerabilities between the two steps were significant in terms of a variety of issues: disruption, the significance of the potential for an error depending on that step and that vulnerability. And so again, I think we had a pretty good, we were powered appropriately in terms of assessing the study, and found this. But what we saw in some of the vulnerabilities, just to give you a sense, so obviously labeling was a big issue. OR, obviously that tends to be sort of a bigger issue. The anesthesiologist or CRNA pulling for multiple drugs and potentially picking the wrong drug. I think some of you know in the OR, some of the labeling might have some similarities and be two different products that do completely different things. And so there's a risk there. The preparation complexity of having to do calculations to draw up the product in a self-fill syringe. The packaging that plays into it, and then also the risk around drug shortages and having kind of potentially different products day to day, week to week. I think we all sort of struggle with that, and just not really necessarily knowing what is available or how that's different, or we're no longer using this narcotic and we're using this other one, and we know that it's not one-to-one in terms of conversion. And so those are some of the vulnerabilities and the steps in the process that were ultimately at risk. Next slide, please. And again, just kind of breaking it down, if you compared in the red the self-filled syringe to the pre-filled syringe, we saw that disruptiveness with pre-filled syringe was obviously much less. At the bottom was basically the steps in the two workflow processes, and then severity, obviously reducing the risk. And so the overall thought with the study was, yes, ready-to-use syringes make sense. That we think it could be safer, but let's ultimately prove that through this study. And again, you can kind of see the results there. Next slide. The other piece, which again was a secondary outcome, and Matt, you can hit one more time, maybe one more, thank you, is just waste reduction. And so I think our pharmacy student loved doing this. He had to collect waste for 20 days total, just get all of these bags of waste of OR drug syringes, and basically calculate what the waste was when we didn't use ready-to-use syringes compared to when we did. And you can see a significant drop in waste. If you are not familiar with ready-to-use, and again, John spoke about this a little bit, right? They are prepackaged, they have tamper evident, they are sealed. And so you could, in a normal case in the OR, you might see an anesthesiologist start preparing drugs before the case even starts, just to have that product ready. And so one, not having to do that, two, being able to reuse product based upon USP 797 standards from case to case with the ready-to-use product, obviously had a significant impact on waste. And I would say, again, John had a much more scientific review, but I would say from a cost perspective, it was definitely cost neutral for us to switch some of our products to the pre-filled or the ready-to-use product, just simply based upon waste, never mind the added advantages around safety. Next slide, please. And then, just more, clinician satisfaction. I think we were confident going into a lot of this that the clinicians would feel like this was advantageous. And so you can see, felt like they wasted less drug, saved them time, 91%. Increase their confidence in the integrity of the product. And, as you can imagine, in wherever you are in the hospital, inpatient, outpatient, the time saved, those are huge components that unfortunately we don't have a hard dollar number for, but we know that can play a large role. And 5 to 6 minutes of not having to prepare drugs, I think is a huge satisfier and a huge advantage in many of our institutions. Next slide. So now the question sort of becomes, okay, let's talk about the practicality of this. So you may say, you know what, Chris, this makes great sense. We think we should do this. Well, you know what, how do I go about this? And I think when we look in the current state, right, there are ready to administer more commercially available type products. There are 503Bs that have pre-filled products that some of us might buy. And some people may have purchased, and the number is not large, technology, robotics, syringe fillers to do some of this work. And so the question really becomes, do we think at our own institutions we could do this better internally? Next slide, please. And so some things to consider here, and obviously when we look at the real-time environment, there's, I think, two big things playing in right now. Number one is labor, right? We are all struggling, especially with technical labor. And do we have the team to be able to do this? Would it be easier to outsource or purchase commercially? I think the second piece that will play into this is, as the new USP guidelines, I put 2023 as those kind of when they go, or really in 2024 when they go into effect, you know, some things to consider here. But obviously cost, you know, can you do this cheaper? You got to consider this is not just a vial to a pre-filled syringe. You have to consider that there is material and labor and overhead that goes into the cost of that product. And so can you negotiate a strong price if you were to buy it ready to administer? The testing, real-time stability, and the testing that you would have to do this internally, and what the cost of that is to your institution. I've talked about labor. You know, I think a lot of us rely on, obviously, if we can get it commercially versus other products, you know, in dealing with drug shortages, wherever we can get that product. And these are primarily generic injectables, specifically that we mainly use in the OR. But how can we sort of get around maybe drug shortages or lessen the impact of drug shortages through that? And then I just don't think, you know I don't have the technology around labeling and all the investment and the difficulty sometimes to just change something simple on a label. And how do we do that to improve safety in terms of ergonomics as well as color and sort of, you know, the angle that you look at the syringe, all of those things play in. Do you have the facilities? And again, will you invest or willing to invest in other technology that might do this for you internally? So again, I'm not saying to completely outsource or buy commercially, but these are things that you need to consider if you were to say, you know what, we're just going to do this internally. Next slide. So just because of time, I'm not going to maybe have you put anything in your question and answer, but things to consider here. Do you use these in your institution? If so, what are the reasons? Or if not, what are the reasons do not? And then if you were to do it, what RTA medications would you select? You know, maybe you don't need to do 15 all at once. Maybe you start with a couple and go from there. And then what is your reasoning for choosing that? So something to kind of think through as we've, you know, as you think about this presentation and sort of, you know, maybe what you're dealing with at your institution to determine, you know, to make a decision whether to go left or right or add more or just stay where you're at if you're not using them. Next slide, please. So, you know, again, I think John had talked about some of these, but just consideration. So specifically as it relates to anesthesia in the OR, right, we had to really partner with anesthesia on this. We had to change kits, OR trays. And so there was going to be a little bit more invasive. Whereas maybe if you're using it in another area, the ICUs, or using it just for narcotics, maybe you don't really need to reach out as much to other providers to talk about the change. And really that could be sort of more pharmacy led. So I think you got to consider the situation, the location, and where that's all going. What product are you going to select? What's the availability? Do they have the strength, the volume, the dose that you are looking for or need in your production? I think this is always something to be reevaluating. You know, for instance, if there's let's say a 5 and a 10 ml syringe and you buy the 10 ml and they're always wasting 5, well, guess what? We're going to, you know, go switch to the 5 ml. So things that you need to continue to look at. Dispense locations. How are you storing that product in your pharmacy? How are you dispensing it? What's the availability of space? What's the availability of drug shortages? And then ultimately workflow, right? So how we're going to distribute it, Do I need to switch all my trays to allow for a little bit more of a pre-filled, ready to administer syringe in that case versus a smaller vial that it might have come in before? How am I managing the inventory, monitoring expiration? And then again, you can see some of the other benefits that we had seen in our study overall that providers really loved. Next slide. Again, some just other considerations that I would suggest. I think, partnering with your vendor in this situation, they can do analysis of what products do you use, what products might come ready to administer, how are you going to change? When we switched out all of our trays, we had the vendor here with us helping to switch out. We had, as you can imagine, hundreds of trays that we had to reconfigure. And so really utilizing some of their labor and resources to do that. As I said, ongoing assessment of utilization. Overall, am I wasting a lot of product? Am I not using it? Is it going to expire? What does that look like? And then you consider areas like, do we buy ready to administer syringes for narcotics, and is there a decreased risk of diversion, or specifically the OR procedure areas, or you might have surgery centers that your pharmacy and department are over. And then what about ambulatory? And I always believe we need more commercially available products. That's the safest, the best way. And so we do need to push our vendors to be providing more of those types of products available to us rather than necessarily have to prepare those in our own pharmacies. Next slide. Just really quick, these are some of the products that we purchase at our organization based upon a ready-to-administer syringe. Primarily, these are mainly used, like I said, in the operating room, but can be used in a variety of other areas as well. Those are in the slides. You can see those. And then just next slide and my final slide, just to kind of some key takeaways here. From our perspective, in terms of the study that we did, we can say confidently that ready-to-administer medications do provide significant reduction to system vulnerabilities and obviously decrease drug waste. The clinicians, providers were very positive on the product. It saved time. Again, a lot of justification for it. I do think hospital pharmacies will have difficulty preparing these products internally based upon all of those factors that we talked about. And so you need to consider those aspects as you're kind of putting your analysis together. And then just some other practical things to consider is product selection, volume sizes, locations, cost. All of those things need to be considered in your decision-making, whether to start with the product or to continue to grow utilizing more ready-to-use products. And with that, I will turn it back over to Matt for our question and answer session.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, John. While I have everyone here, I'll keep this slide up, everybody who the participants listening in. This is again the instructions for the Pro CE. These will be also in your handouts that you got from the webpage, so all the links will be there. But the key thing is that attendance code at the bottom. So I'll keep this. I see John and Chris feverishly writing this number down too, by the way. 113-02022. So I'll keep this up here for a while, guys, and because the next slide is just questions. So a couple of questions. We have quite a few questions in the box. We'll get to a couple before 2 o'clock. I'll direct the first question to Chris, and John, you can follow up as well. There's two similar questions. I'll read through them, but the same thing about the costs. One person puts in here, but the costs come out of different buckets, and pharmacies under-reviewed for the financial cost of drugs. How do you get the message across senior leadership to look at total costs to the organization and that whole pharmacy to that budget? And Tyler also put in here, but again, message. What's the message to the hospital executive staff about budgeting? Because again, very siloed. It's about more about the product costs and about staffing and time and error cost savings. So, Chris, I'll let you go with that one first.
Yeah, a lot to that question. I think right, it's a tough one to say. Indirectly, we think we'll reduce errors, and here's the cost associated with that, right? Because I think administrators very much are about the hard dollars and where those are at. So, again, I think in different hospitals, some of this cost may be on the pharmacy. Sometimes when I started here at Mass General, a lot of this was purchased and paid for by anesthesia, which was kind of nice because they had some skin in the game here to sort of manage their drug costs. So I think you got to kind of tell the whole story. It's not necessarily an easy one to say, well, we're going to save in drug waste as well as it's going to cost some more money and we're going to improve our savings. I think hopefully administrators will see the importance of just the added safety aspects, the time saved, that John and I spoke about, overall. So again, I don't know if I have sort of the exact answer. I think you got to kind of maneuver best in your organization to really kind of assess where those important points are that you think will help support that. I think when you talk about a labor perspective and sort of saying, well, I could, have less labor, I think we all are down so many people that, we're going to need people to do other things. And trust me, there's enough work to go around that we can't say, well, you're going to cut 3 FTEs or whatever the number is because you're going to move to a ready-to-administer syringe. I think, I'll give you an example right now. I think we all have an albuterol shortage. We're having to, draw up albuterol into large syringe sizes, and we calculated it's going to take about 10 minutes to make one of them. And so that's where I'm going to put my techs to do some of this work to help battle some of our drug shortages and some of our other staffing shortages in the organization.
John, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would. I mean, Chris always does a really nice job answering that question, but I will say this is not about labor reduction. It's about labor optimization and reallocation, because there's going to be more work to be done. And it does represent an opportunity as well to engage with our colleagues outside of pharmacy. I mean, look at the nurses. They don't love having to witness all the waste and get pulled away from their stuff. So in some ways, this is also a satisfaction discussion. How can we engage with our partners outside of pharmacy to make their lives a little bit easier? Anesthesiologists in our ORs and procedural areas are another wonderful partner when we've had this discussion, because they don't want to waste. They don't want to have to deal with it either. And so having those debates and discussions, as Chris alluded to, outside of just pharmacy, I think will yield positive results. It's not just about leaning on soft costs, but really engaging others in this holistic discussion.
Thanks, John. I'm going to read one comment here from Mary in the Q&A box because they also used RTA syringes, and she's stating here one of the best RTA syringes they did was methohexatol. They audited the values, and on paper they administered more than what they purchased because they took 1 vial out per patient, but then split a vial between 5 patients, and then they may have returned the other vials. So there's a lot of gyrations going back and forth. So just switching to 100 milligram syringes for them completely eliminated all the accounting issues while making it much safer. One more question for both of you guys. So for RTA considerations for narcotics, this organization, they allow for range doses for opioids. So what considerations should be made when assessing whether to bring in RTA products of opioids when you don't have a set usual dose? With opioids, doses are all over the place anyway. Is the recommendation to provide the lower end of the usual range and require administering 2 syringes, or provide higher doses? I know that's probably a great area, Chris. So what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a great area. I mean, I think, one of the good things around ready-to-administer narcotics is that you have a pretty good understanding of what drug waste is, because they're already in a syringe. You can see what the amount is, and obviously in terms of the wasting product, feel a little bit more confident with that. I think I don't know. I don't necessarily have the confident answer. I think you kind of probably going to have to play around with it. I mean, I would, if it were me, I would probably side on more of the smaller sizes, and have to use an extra one if you do, and then figure out, are you using more of the smaller and not ever having to go to the second one, or you just need to go to a bigger size in general because the majority of your doses are, meeting up to that. So I think it's probably a little bit of an assessment, but I would probably start out with going with some of the smaller sizes again, so that you don't have to waste product if that larger size is not needed, or larger dose is not needed.
Yeah, and I assume, Chris and John, hopefully EHRs can maybe assess the most common doses administered in an organization to at least give them guidance of, hey, our most popular, most used doses 0.5 hydromorphine as an example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that speaks to the point. One of my takeaways is do your own research. Look at your own institution, what you use, what you need, where you can optimize. Our research is valid, but it applies everywhere a little differently. So understanding your own organization is really important as you go down this journey.
All right. Well, Chris and John, thank you very, very much for your presentation today. I want to thank the audience as well who stayed in and listened to our webinar today. Just as a upcoming announcement, ICMP will have an International Medication Safety Update webinar about 3 weeks from today, middle of December, and also we'll have a series of webinars on diversion as well at the beginning of next year. So on that note, I hope everyone has a great holiday. I'm going to talk to you again. Thank you for attending, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you.